Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into something that might sound a little dry at first glance, complex research designs. But stick with us, because it's way more interesting than it sounds.
Mm.
You guys sent us a chapter from a research methods textbook about these designs, which are also called factorial designs. And honestly, this stuff's pretty crucial if you want to understand how scientists really figure things out.
Yeah, it's like if you only look at one piece of the puzzle, you're never going to see the full picture.
That's a great way to put it. So today we're going to try to put those puzzle pieces together and see how these complex designs help us understand how different factors work together,
hmm
or sometimes against each other, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is, and that's what makes research so fascinating, right? It's like we're constantly peeling back the layers of an onion, revealing all these intricate connections between different factors.
Okay, so speaking of onions, this chapter we're looking at starts with this idea of factorial combination, which kind of sounds like a science experiment gone wrong.
Yeah. Well, it kind of IS a science experiment, but in a good way. Imagine you're trying to figure out the perfect pizza. You got the crust, the sauce, the toppings, and you can combine those in all sorts of ways.
Okay, now you're speaking my language.
So with factorial combination, you're basically testing out all the different combos to see what happens. Maybe thin crust is usually best, BUT, when you add spicy sausage, deep dish wins every time.
Ooh, controversial. I like it.
Right. That's an interaction when the combo creates a result you wouldn't predict from either factor alone. And that's what these complex designs are all about, understanding those interactions.
So researchers are creating these pizza recipes to understand human behavior too.
Exactly. And one of the studies in the chapter that really illustrates this is the Kassin, Goldstein, and Savitsky study from 2003. They were looking at police interrogations, and specifically how subtle cues from the interrogator can actually impact a suspect's behavior.
Hmm. So, like, even if the interrogator isn't trying to be biased, they could still be sending signals that influence the suspect.
Absolutely. Think about it. Even small things like body language or tone of voice can convey a lot of information.
That's true. We don't always realize how much we're communicating nonverbally.
Right. So in this study, they used a 2-by-2 design. That means they had two variables, each with two levels.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. One variable was whether the suspect was actually guilty or innocent.
Thanks.
And the other variable was whether the interrogator thought the suspect was guilty.
Ah, so it's like a double-blind situation, but for
Yeah.
interrogations, that's fascinating.
Right. So they basically created these four different scenarios.
Mm.
Guilty suspect with a believing interrogator, guilty suspect with a doubting interrogator, innocent suspect with a believing interrogator, and innocent suspect with a doubting interrogator. And then they looked at how those different combinations played out.
Okay, so what did they find? Spill the tea.
Well, first of all, they found that interrogators who expected guilt asked way more guilt-presumptive questions. So instead of asking, "Do you know anything about the missing money?" they'd ask, "How did you spend the money you stole?" You see the difference there.
Yeah, that's pretty leading. It's like they've already decided the person is guilty and they're just trying to get them to confess.
Exactly. And that's what we call a main effect, the overall influence of the interrogator's expectation, regardless of whether the suspect was actually guilty or not.
Wow. So even trained professionals, people who are supposed to be objective, can fall prey to this kind of confirmation bias.
It happens more often than you might think. It's this human tendency to look for evidence that supports what we already believe, even if that evidence isn't really there.
That's pretty unsettling when you think about the implications, especially in a high-stakes situation like a police interrogation. But okay, so that's one main effect. What about the other variable? Did they find any main effects for whether the suspect was actually guilty?
They did. And this is where it gets even more interesting and a bit more disturbing. They found that interrogators actually used more persuasive techniques on suspects who were innocent.
Hold on. That doesn't make sense. Why would they do that?
It seems counterintuitive, right? You'd think they'd be more careful and less aggressive when they suspected someone was innocent.
Yeah, you'd think so.
But the researchers suggest that maybe interrogators overcompensate when they suspect innocence. Maybe they're trying extra hard to elicit a confession because they feel like they have to prove something, or maybe they're unconsciously trying to convince themselves that the suspect is guilty after all. It's hard to say for sure.
That is really interesting, though. So we've got two seemingly simple variables, and already we're seeing these complex and kind of disturbing findings.
Exactly. And these main effects are really just the tip of the iceberg.
Mhm.
Remember, the real power of these complex designs is uncovering those interaction effects, those unique outcomes you get from the combination of variables.
Okay, so if we go back to the interrogation study, Was there an interaction effect there, too? I mean, besides those two main effects we talked about.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a big one. They found that the effect of the interrogator's expectation, whether they thought the suspect was guilty, was even stronger when the suspect was actually innocent.
Oh, wow. So the interrogator's bias really kicked into overdrive when they were questioning someone who was actually innocent.
It seems that way, like our preconceived notions about guilt really took over and influenced their behavior even more when the suspect was actually innocent.
That's kind of terrifying. It really shows how these complex designs can reveal these subtle nuances that we wouldn't catch otherwise.
Exactly. And that's why they're so valuable. They allow us to see these intricate relationships between different factors and how they can combine in unexpected ways. Now, the chapter also talks about something called simple main effects, which sounds a little confusing.
Yeah, it seems like it should be the opposite of complex designs. But for what I'm gathering, it's like we're taking a magnifying glass to those interaction effects and really zooming in to see exactly where those differences are, right? Like breaking down those combinations even further.
That's a perfect way to think about it. So, for example, in that interrogation study, we could use simple main effects to see if the effect of the interrogator's expectation was different for guilty suspects versus innocent suspects.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like we're breaking down the interaction effect into smaller pieces to understand the specifics. Got it. Now, the chapter also uses another study to showcase what a three-way interaction looks like, which sounds even more complex. The Pingitor study from 1994 about weight discrimination, they had three independent variables, right? Talk about a complicated pizza recipe.
You got it. They had applicant weight, applicant sex, and participant body schema, which basically means how much people are concerned about their own body image.
Got it. So how did that all play out?
Well, they showed participants videos of these mock job interviews and asked them to rate how hireable each applicant was.
Okay, standard procedure. So three variables each with two levels. That's like 8 different groups. That's a lot to keep track of.
Right. But that's the beauty of these designs. They allow us to see how all these different factors are working together.
So what did they find? Any juicy interaction effects in this one?
Oh, yeah. They found a two-way interaction between applicant weight and applicant sex, BUT. This interaction was only present for participants who were high in body schema.
Okay, so people who were already sensitive to body image issues showed a different pattern of bias than people who weren't. Interesting.
And it gets even more specific than that. They found that people high in body schema rated overweight female applicants lower than overweight male applicants.
Whoa. So the bias wasn't just about weight. It was about the combination of weight and gender, and it was only present in people who were already sensitive to body image issues. That's a lot.
Right. But that's the beauty of complex designs. They allow us to untangle these webs of influence and see how all these different factors are intertwining.
I'm starting to see why these designs are so powerful, but I have to admit, my brain is feeling a little overloaded, like we just ate a whole pizza.
I hear you. It's a lot to take in, but the good news is, once you understand the basic principles, it starts to make a lot more sense.
Okay, that's reassuring. But how do researchers actually analyze the data from these designs? Because that's where I start to get lost. It all seems like this big statistical black box.
I get it. But don't worry, we'll try to break it down in a way that makes sense.
I hope so, because otherwise I might just have to order another pizza and call it a night.
No, you're going to be fine. It's all about asking the right questions, just like we are now. And speaking of asking the right questions, that's a great place to pick up in the next part of our deep dive. All right, so data analysis from complex designs. Where were we?
Yeah, you were going to try to demystify all the statistical stuff for me. Make it less intimidating,
Yeah.
you know?
Okay, well, the main thing to remember is that it's all about looking for patterns in the data. We're trying to see if there's evidence for those main effects and interaction effects that we were just talking about.
Okay, so it's not just about crunching numbers. It's about looking for meaning in those numbers. Got it. So where do we start?
The first step is to see if there's a statistically significant interaction effect. Basically, that means we're checking to see if the combination of variables is creating something unique, something we wouldn't expect from just looking at the main effects alone.
So like those moments where the variables are doing a little dance together and creating a result that's unexpected.
Yeah, exactly. Like when you mix two chemicals together and they create this whole new substance with different properties. And if we do find a significant interaction effect, that's where things get really exciting. That's when we know we need to dig deeper and try to understand what's going on.
Okay, so it's like we're looking for those sparks, those moments where the variables are really reacting with each other in a meaningful way. I like that.
Yeah, and if there's no significant interaction, well, then it's a bit less exciting, but still important.
Oh, What happens then?
Well, then we shift our focus to the main effects, those individual impacts of each variable.
Gotcha. So it's not like a failure if there's no interaction.
Mhm.
It just means we're looking at the data from a different angle. Makes sense. So the chapter has another study, the Kaiser et al. Study from 2006, that shows how this all works in practice. And this one's about non-conscious attention to sexist words. So like, even if we're not aware of these words, they can still affect us somehow.
Yeah, that's the idea they were testing. They used this task called the emotional Stroop task, which is kind of a classic in psychology. It measures how quickly people can name the color of a word when it flashes on a screen really briefly.
I think I've heard of that. So like that if the word is red, but it's written in blue ink, it takes our brains a little longer to process that and say blue.
Right. Exactly. It creates a bit of a mental hiccup. And the idea is that if a word is emotionally charged for you for some reason, you'll be even slower to name the color.
Okay, I'm with you. So how does this relate to sexist words?
Well, what they did was they had a group of women who were anticipating interacting with a sexist man and another group who weren't. And they measured how quickly they could name the color of different types of words. Some were sexist words, some were neutral words, and some were just kind of control words.
Okay, so what did they find? Did those sexist words create a mental speed bump?
They did. The women who were anticipating sexism were slower to name the color of those sexist words compared to the other types of words. But this wasn't true for the women who weren't expecting sexism.
So even though they couldn't consciously read the words because they were flashed so quickly, those sexist words were still grabbing their attention on some level.
Yeah, exactly. It's like those words were kind of sneaking in under the radar and creating this interference.
That's kind of wild. So that's the interaction effect right there.
Yeah.
The effect of the word type depended on whether the woman was feeling threatened or safe.
Right. The social context was playing a role in how those words were processed, even at this non-conscious level.
Okay, so this is where those simple main effects come into play, right?
Mhm.
We can really zoom in and see how the effective word type, whether it was sexist or neutral, really depended on the social context.
Precisely. And that's where those simple main effects come in handy. They allow us to break down that interaction and see those specific differences.
Cool. But okay, there's one thing I don't quite get. The chapter mentions that they also found that women in the threat condition paid similar attention to the neutral words and the sexist words. So even words like table or chair were grabbing their attention just as much as those sexist words. That doesn't really make sense to me.
I know, it's weird, right? But it really shows how powerful subtle cues can be. The researchers suggested that maybe those neutral words were taking on a different meaning in the minds of those women. Like maybe the word kitchen was suddenly triggering thoughts about gender stereotypes or something.
Huh. That's actually pretty profound. So it's not just about the words themselves, it's about the context and the individual's mindset.
Exactly. And that makes this whole idea of interaction effects even more fascinating, but also way more complex, I know.
Yeah, my brain is already doing backflips trying to keep up with all this. But okay, so that's what happens when there I instance an interaction effect, right? We break it down, use those simple main effects to understand the nuances. But what about when there's no interaction? Like, what do researchers do then?
Well, it's not a dead end or anything. It just means the combination of variables isn't creating anything unique. So then we shift our focus back to those main effects, look at the overall impact of each variable separately.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
So each study or each analysis might have a different story to tell.
Exactly. And sometimes that story is about the interaction, and sometimes it's about the individual variables. It all depends on the data.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, the chapter talks about the conscious condition of that Kaiser study as an example of what happens when there's no interaction. So this time, the words were presented long enough for the women to actually read them, not just unconsciously process them.
Right. So in this case, there was no interaction between social identity threat and word type. It didn't matter whether the women were expecting to interact with a sexist man or not.
Okay, but there was still a main effect of word type, right?
Yes. They found that overall, women were slower to name the color of sexist words compared to neutral words, regardless of the social context.
Interesting. So even at a conscious level, those sexist words were still kind of throwing them off a little bit.
Yeah. But the fact that there was no interaction this time means that the effect was pretty much the same for both groups of women. The threat didn't make a difference in this case.
Okay, so the takeaway here is that sometimes the context matters, sometimes it doesn't. And these complex designs can help us tease apart those different scenarios.
Exactly. And it really highlights how complex human behavior is. There's rarely a simple answer, you know? It often depends on a whole bunch of different factors and how those factors are interacting.
So it's not just about understanding the what of these complex designs, but also the how and the why. Like, we got to be able to look under the hood and see how all those gears are turning.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking skills come in. We need to be able to ask ourselves questions like, did they choose the right variables? Did they control for other things that could be influencing the results? Are they overgeneralizing their findings?
Right. So we can't just blindly accept the conclusions of a study just because it uses a complex design. We need to be able to evaluate it for ourselves, like become research detectives or something.
Exactly. And the more we practice those critical thinking skills, the better we'll get at separating the good research from the not so good research. And that's a skill that's useful in all areas of life, not just science, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
It's about being a savvy consumer of information, which is more important now than ever. Okay, so we've covered main effects, interaction effects, simple mind effects, those tricky confounds, all that good stuff. But the chapter also mentions something about how these designs can help us test theories.
Ah, yes. Because remember, science isn't just about collecting data, it's about explaining that data and understanding why things happen the way they do. And that's where theories come in.
Right, theories give us a framework for understanding the world, like a roadmap for research.
Exactly. And complex designs are really powerful tools for testing those theories.
Okay, how so? Give me an example.
Okay, well, let's go back to that coffee and productivity thing we were talking about earlier. Say you find that people who drink coffee tend to be more productive. But remember, correlation doesn't equal causation, right?
Right. Maybe those people who are already more ambitious and driven are just more likely to drink coffee in the first place. We don't know for sure which came first, the coffee or the ambition.
Exactly. And that's where complex designs can help us tease those things apart. Instead of just observing people in the real world, we can create an experiment where we manipulate the variables we're interested in.
Okay, so we could randomly assign some people to drink coffee and some to drink decaf, and then see who's more productive. And control for things like natural motivation levels.
You got it. By manipulating those variables and controlling for those confounds, we can start to get a better sense of whether there's a causal relationship or not.
Gotcha. So it's about taking those correlations we observe in the real world and testing them in a more controlled setting, using these complex designs to help us rule out those alternative explanations.
Exactly. And it allows us to test those what if scenarios, you know? Like,
Yeah.
what if we give people different types of tasks to do? Or what if we vary the amount of caffeine they consume? By systematically testing those different possibilities, we can start to build a more complete picture of how these variables are working together.
It's like we're creating this multi-dimensional map of the phenomenon instead of just seeing a single snapshot. I love it.
Me too. That's what makes research so exciting, right? It's this constant process of discovery and refinement. We're always learning new things, and complex designs are one of the most powerful tools we have for doing that.
I'm so glad we're talking about this because I feel like I'm finally starting to understand how all of this works. It's like a light bulb has finally gone off in my brain. But okay, let's be real. The chapter also mentions some potential pitfalls of complex designs.
Of course. No research design is perfect, and complex designs have their fair share of challenges. Like, what kind of pitfalls are you thinking about?
Well, for one, they can get really complicated really quickly. Like if you're adding more and more variables and more levels to those variables, the number of different conditions in your study just explodes, right? And it seems like it would be a logistical nightmare to manage all that.
Oh, absolutely. You're spot on. It's like trying to juggle a dozen balls at once. And it can be really tough to recruit enough participants for all those different groups.
Not to mention all the time and resources it takes to actually analyze all that data. I can see how this could get out of hand really quickly.
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure. We want to explore all those complexities, but we also have to be realistic about what's feasible.
Right. It's like we're trying to build this super intricate model of human behavior, but we also have to make sure it doesn't collapse under its own weight.
That's such a great analogy. We need to find that sweet spot, a design that's complex enough to capture the nuances, but not so complex that it becomes unmanageable.
Okay, so that's one pitfall. What else should we be aware of?
Well, another one is that even with the most carefully designed study, we're still only getting a glimpse of reality. Like, we can't control for every possible factor, right?
Right, because real life is messy and unpredictable and full of surprises.
Exactly. And so we need to be careful about overgeneralizing our findings. We can't assume that what we find in our study will automatically apply to everyone in every situation.
So those not-to-scale warnings on maps, we need those for research findings too.
Totally. It's a good reminder that research is always an approximation of reality, We're always trying to get closer to the truth, but we can never be absolutely sure we've arrived.
Okay, so humility is key. I can get behind that.
Definitely. Okay, so we've talked about those pitfalls, but before we move on, there's one more really important thing I want to talk about: how complex designs can help us understand contradictory findings in research.
Oh, yeah. Those times when you read two different studies that seem to be looking at the same thing, but they come up with completely opposite results.
Exactly. And it can be super frustrating, right? Like, who are you supposed to believe?
Right. Like, does coffee boost productivity or not? Make up your mind. Science.
I know, it can be confusing. But the thing is, those contradictory findings often arise because of subtle differences in the way the studies were conducted. Like maybe they used different populations or different measures, or maybe there was some hidden confound that they didn't account for.
So it's like those detective shows where they have to piece together all the clues and figure out which ones are relevant and which ones are red herrings.
Exactly. And that's where complex designs can be really helpful. They allow us to systematically vary those different factors and see how they affect the relationship between our key variables.
Okay, so instead of just throwing our hands up in the air and saying science is broken, we can use these designs to help us unravel those discrepancies and figure out why those studies are giving us different answers.
Exactly. And by doing that, we can actually gain a deeper understanding of the phenomenon we're studying.
I like that, turning those confusing contradictions into opportunities for learning. Okay, so give me an example of how you could use a complex design to understand a contradictory finding.
Okay, well, remember that weight discrimination study we talked about earlier, the one with the three-way interaction?
Yeah, the one where people who are really sensitive to body image were more likely to discriminate against overweight women.
Right. Now, imagine another study came along and found no evidence of weight discrimination at all. How could we explain that?
Hmm. Well, maybe they used a different population of participants. Like maybe they only tested people who weren't sensitive to body image issues.
That's one possibility. Or maybe they used a different type of job in their mock interview,
Yeah.
like maybe a job where appearance wasn't as important.
Or maybe they measured discrimination in a different way. Like maybe they didn't just ask for ratings, but they actually looked at hiring decisions. So many possibilities.
Exactly. And that's where a complex design could help us sort it all out. We could systematically vary those factors: the participant's body schema, the type of job, the way we measure discrimination, and see if those things make a difference in whether we find evidence of weight discrimination or not.
So it's like we're creating this more detailed map of the phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
Instead of just seeing one point on the map, we're seeing a whole landscape.
Exactly. And by exploring all those different contours of the landscape, we can start to understand the conditions under which this phenomenon is more or less likely to occur.
It's like we're upgrading from a black and white photo to a full-color 3D movie. Okay, so we've talked about how complex designs can help us test theories and untangle contradictory findings. What else can they do?
Well, another area where they can be really helpful is in studying what we call natural groups. These are groups that already exist in the world, like men and women, or people with different personality types.
Okay, so we're not manipulating a variable like we did in that coffee study. We're looking at groups that are already different in some way.
Got it. But how do we know that those differences are really due to the group membership and not something else? Like in that example from the chapter about musicians having a better memory for melodies, how do we know it's because they're musicians and not just because they have a better memory in general?
That's a great question. And that's where the challenge lies with natural groups designs. It's hard to tease apart what's causing those differences.
So how can complex designs help? How do we know it's the musical training and not just their awesome memory skills in general?
Well, the key here is to manipulate another variable that we think might be involved in the relationship and then look for an interaction effect.
Okay, my brain is ready for another pretzel. Give me an example. Sure. So in that musician study, the researchers, Halpern and Bauer, their theory was that musicians were better at chunking information, grouping the notes into meaningful units, which made them easier to remember.
Okay, kind of like how we chunk phone numbers into smaller bits to remember them better.
Exactly. So to test this theory, they manipulated the structure of the melodies they presented to participants. They had some melodies that were well structured, some that were poorly structured, and some that were just random.
Okay, so they're changing the chunkability of melodies.
Yeah.
But how does this help them figure out if it's the musical training that's causing the difference in memory or something else?
Because they predicted that the difference in memory performance between musicians and non-musicians would be biggest for those well-structured melodies that were easy to chunk and smallest for those random melodies that were hard to chunk.
Ah, I see. So if it's really about musical training and chunking ability, that difference should show up most strongly when the chunking is easy, right? And if it's just about having a good memory in general, then you'd expect the musicians to outperform everyone on all the melodies, regardless of the structure.
Exactly. And that's exactly what they found, the interaction effect they were looking for. The difference between musicians and non-musicians was biggest for those well-structured melodies. And that supports their theory that it's about chunking ability, not just general memory skills.
Oh, okay, that's actually really cool. So even though they couldn't randomly assign people to be musicians or not, they could still use this complex design to test their theory and strengthen their argument.
Exactly. And it shows how those interaction effects can be like those aha moments in research, where a seemingly small piece of evidence can suddenly unlock a whole new understanding. So, to sum it all up, these complex designs are incredibly versatile tools. We can use them to test theories, unpack contradictory findings, and make stronger causal arguments, even in situations where we can't randomly assign people to groups.
This deep dive has been amazing. I feel like I've learned so much, and my brain has expanded like 10 sizes.
Mine too. And it's so cool to see how these seemingly abstract statistical concepts can actually help us understand real-world phenomena in such a deep way.
Absolutely. But before we completely geek out on stats, I think it's important to remember that even with all these fancy tools and designs, research is still a human endeavor, right? We're
Right.
still trying to make sense of a complex world using imperfect methods.
You're so right. And I think that's a good place to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into complex research designs. And I gotta say, I'm still processing everything we've talked about so far. It's like my brain has been doing mental gymnastics for the past hour.
I hear you. We've covered a lot of ground main effects, interaction effects, simple main effects, those tricky confounders, and it can definitely feel overwhelming at times.
It is, but it's also super fascinating. Like, I'm actually starting to understand how research works and how we can use these complex designs to unpack all these complicated questions about human behavior.
Right. And that's what makes it all worth it, those moments when you suddenly see the connections and the patterns and it all starts to click.
Yeah, those are good moments. But before we get too carried away with all the aha moments, I think it's important to circle back to something we talked about earlier, being a critical consumer of research findings.
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial point. It's so easy to get swept away by those catchy headlines and those counterintuitive findings, but we got to remember that not all research is created equal.
Right. Just because a study uses a complex design doesn't mean it's automatically good research.
Exactly. We need to be able to evaluate those findings for ourselves and decide whether they're actually valid and meaningful.
So how do we do that? What are some red flags we should be watching out for?
Well, one thing to consider is whether the researchers chose the right variables to study in the first place. Like, are they actually measuring what they claim to be measuring? And are they defining those variables in a clear and consistent way?
Right, because if they're not even measuring the right things, then the whole study is basically garbage, right? No matter how fancy their design is.
Pretty much. So that's the first thing I always look at the variables. Are they relevant? Are they well defined? If not, then I move on.
Makes sense. So what else should we be looking for?
Another big one is whether they've controlled for those pesky confounders. Remember, a confound is basically anything that could be messing up the results, making it hard to tell what's really going on.
Right, like in that coffee example. If they don't control for people's natural motivation levels, they might think the coffee is causing the productivity boost, when really it's just that more motivated people drink more coffee.
Exactly. And in a complex design where you have multiple variables at play, there are even more potential confounders to worry about.
Oh, great. So it's like we're trying to solve a mystery, but there are all these red herrings scattered around the crime scene.
It's a good analogy, and that's why it's so important to read that methods section carefully and see what steps the researchers took to control for those confounders. If they haven't done a good job, then you got to take their findings with a grain of salt.
Okay, so we're basically research detectives now, scrutinizing every detail.
Exactly. And here's another clue to watch out for: overgeneralization. Just because a study found something in a specific group of people doesn't mean it's going to apply to everyone.
Right, like if they only tested college students, they can't assume that their findings will automatically apply to older adults or to people from different cultures.
Exactly. We got to be careful about those sweeping generalizations. And even when a study is well designed and carefully controlled, we still need to remember that there's always a margin of error.
Oh, right. statistics and probability and all that, we can never be 100% certain that our findings are a perfect reflection of reality, right?
Right. So it's all about being cautious and nuanced in our interpretations. We need to avoid those black and white conclusions and embrace those shades of gray.
Yeah, shades of gray are where it's at. Okay, so I feel like we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From those fascinating studies about police interrogations and weight discrimination to the nuts and bolts of how we actually analyze the data and interpret the findings, it's been quite a journey.
It has, and I hope it's helped demystify some of those complex research designs and shown how they can be such powerful tools for understanding the world around us.
It totally has. I feel like I've gained this whole new set of lenses for looking at research and for thinking critically about information in general. It's like I've leveled up my brain or something.
That's awesome. And remember, this is just the beginning. There's always more to learn and more to explore.
So true. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
I agree. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. Keep those brains buzzing.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep learning and keep asking those tough questions.